Hey, do you remember those falling sand games that were playable in your PC browser back in around the mid 2000s? They were simple simulations in which you could manipulate powders of different colors and properties. These were a default of mine to hop on and kill the last few minutes of computer class back in middle school. I don't know what it was about choreographing those little pixels, but it simply mesmerized my young undercooked brain. Well, the developers at Nala Games seem to have had these in mind when collaborating on Noita, a 2D action roguelite with a unique focus on particle physics simulation. On the surface, it sounds gimmicky, good for a few hours of fun until it sits forever in your Steam library forgotten. Luckily, Noita is so much more than that. It's a well-crafted experience that deserves a closer look. The first time you boot up Noita, you are presented with a series of pictographs outlining the game's lore. There is no exposition dump, and it isn't made entirely clear at the start, but the story is based on a 19th century Finnish work of epic poetry called Kalevala. Without getting into spoilers, the creator loon had laid 3 eggs. The first egg tumbled from the nest and outspilled the god of nature, along with the forces of life and death. From the second egg, the god of magic was hatched, and the third the god of technology. The pictograph is the only lore directly delivered to the player, but a more detailed explanation can be pieced together by decoding hidden messages. These messages must be located, then revealed, then decoded, and finally translated into English as the final messages are written in Finnish. Unless of course you can read Finnish, in which case, good for you, Mr. Polyglot. Other pieces of lore can be uncovered via cryptic glyphs, books, graffiti, and implied from objects and interactions in the gameplay. Think Dark Souls. All of it is presented in such a way that it is clear that the designers trusted the player to find it on their own. It is smart, subtle, and rewarding in a way that can't be achieved through standard cutscenes or info dumps through codices. The first thing you'll notice about Noita upon starting up a game are its visuals. It utilizes a 2D pixel art style, which makes a lot of sense since each individual pixel is simulated. This means that liquids and powders flow hypnotically, gases rise and obscure your vision, and explosions are devastating yet mesmerizing. Too often I found myself stopping to watch my handiwork in action, usually to my immediate demise. Spells are all unique and colorful, and honestly one part of the game I found unexpectedly thrilling was firing each of these off for the first time, just to see what they look like. The initial level designs appear dark and drab, with little in the way of color variety. This does make it easier to see spells, magical liquids, fires, enemies, and other hazards, as these are typically colored vibrantly by comparison. As you delve a bit deeper into the levels of Noita, the color palette does expand and change, but the most vivid objects are consistently the ones that you should be paying most attention to. Character and enemy designs are simple, but they look appealing enough, and it is easy to determine what they're supposed to be. An efficient use of detail with limited sprite resolution. A favorite of mine is a leggy mimic. Not for any specific reason other than he's just goofy and fun. I mean, look at him. Animations are all quite snappy, and they do not distract from the action. One complaint I do have is that enemy variants often look a bit too similar to each other, so it can be difficult to determine which you are facing. The sound effects in Noita do the job. Spells sound punchy and magical, water sounds wet, and explosions muffle the sound of everything else around them, giving them a proper feeling of force. The ambient sounds such as water dripping from the roof of a cave to the crackling of fire burning breathe life into the world. The soundtrack to Noita is superbly psychedelic and absolutely rocks. I actually had the OST on a loop while writing the script for this review. It's seriously that good. The game's overall atmosphere benefits from the choice of musical style, and everything feels very cohesive. Everything works together to create a world that's just unfamiliar enough to pique your curiosity and want to learn more. The core gameplay loop has you utilizing the tools at your disposal, including wands that cast magic spells, and potions of varying effects to descend dungeon levels to reach the exit. All the while, you must contend with enemies and hazards which all have the potential to prematurely end your run. After all, this is a roguelite, which means one death is all it takes to send you back to ground level to attempt your descent again. The walk into the cavern will be a familiar sight in the first few hours of the game. Noita is difficult, and it expects you to decipher its many systems on your own, but it is worth the effort, I promise. So you might be thinking, run to the exit as fast as possible to minimize my exposure to the danger on each level, right? Well, not exactly. Throughout each level are wands, perks, potions, and other objects that will help you survive this and future stages. Rushing past and not collecting any of these tools will leave you underpowered for future levels, meaning the game will only become that much more difficult. You need to balance your immediate survival with gathering enough gear and gold to have even the faintest hope to clear later levels. Gold? Yes, enemies drop gold when defeated. You should make collecting this a priority. Gold can be traded at the safe haven between levels known as the Holy Mountain to buy more spells and modifications for your wands. Honestly, this is hands down my favorite part of Noita. Wands can be modified and customized while in the safety of the Holy Mountain. And oh boy can we get creative with this. Sparkbolt spell not quite doing it for you? Take 8 of them and line them up on a wand with simultaneous casting. Spitterbolt just not have enough range? Throw a long distance cast modification on it, now that isn't a problem. Not to suggest all mods are good though. There are some duds and other that are outright dangerous. But maybe you can see a use for the chaotic path modification that I just don't understand. Not all wand chassis are created equal either. Each spawns with a unique set of randomized stats which include total slots, spell shuffle, mana maximum, and more. Also worth a quick mention are perks, another source of character progression during each run. While not as exciting as spells, they are just as useful. You get one for free at each visit to the Holy Mountain, and these grant you passive abilities, such as giving you unlimited spells for the rest of the run, causing your projectiles to home towards targets, or even invisibility. I mentioned earlier that fluids and powders can flow. This has the potential to create some interesting situations, as these can act as alchemical reagents and react with each other. At times this can be very useful, and other times dangerous or confusing. It makes sense that a lantern tumbling onto an exposed pile of gunpowder would lead to a massive explosion. But would you have guessed that whiskey can be transmuted into a substance called berserkium? Now how would we do this? By spilling some on the corpse of a cave frog, of course. Neat. The nature of the simulation means that these reactions often trigger when you do not intend them to. It's difficult to not get greedy when you come across a cache of potions, seemingly taunting you into breaking down that wall and freeing them. But if you aren't careful, well, yeah. If a material flows, then it can be collected using a flask. Just place the neck underneath the surface of the target substance, and that's it. Now you can spray or drink the contents to impart their effects, or even throw the whole bottle as a projectile if you'd like. It's always a laugh to toss a container full of random powder towards a baddie. You never know what's going to come out of it. Unfortunately, such tactics often work against you. Now it might sound like I think that the gameplay is flawless, but this is not the case. While I wouldn't suggest that the developers make changes, I do acknowledge that the game is unforgiving to new players. It can be frustrating and at times downright unfair. Sometimes the perks and spells you find just won't cut it on later levels, or maybe a stray shot from an enemy starts an explosive chain reaction. Back to the surface. While RNG is the nature of the genre and can be forgiven, the lack of a tutorial for the wand system is a little more troublesome. While its opaque implementation does encourage experimentation, it won't be long before you head over to the wiki to get some sort of explanation. This is my biggest gripe though, and it can be easily remedied with a little time and some research. Noita is a game that you play with a mouse and keyboard. According to the Steam page, there is partial controller support implemented, but you might as well just be playing with oven mitts, as controllers just lack precision. This is a bit unfortunate too, as I could see myself sitting back on the couch for a few hours while sharing the experience with some friends. But it would quickly become frustrating as the fine control that I am accustomed to just can't be properly translated. That aside, the keyboard and mouse controls are simple and intuitive. WASD to move, mouse to aim, left click for spell, and right click to throw a flask. There is an inventory screen to select wands and spells, but no complex menus or keybinds to memorize. Upon starting the game, there is a simple menu, and just with a single click, you are in the caverns and on your way. There's also an option for Twitch integration where viewers can have their names displayed in-game and vote for specific events during gameplay. There is an extensive list of these events, and they can be toggled using a simple checkbox if there are any that are undesired. Noita is not an overly demanding game unless played at its highest settings, and even then, typically only when there's a lot of action on screen. A multi-core processor and a dedicated GPU are recommended, but it is entirely playable even on mid-range systems. I encountered no bugs or glitches through my many hours of vanilla playtime, but mods might understandably lead to some instability. Honestly, if you have a computer from the past 5 years, you should be able to play this in some capacity. Each of the game's runs must come to an end in one way or another, and usually that's due to yet another stupid death. But eventually you will reach the mountaintop and be greeted with the game's ending screen, only to find out what a fool you've been. I won't spoil any of the endings for you, but just know they aren't the conclusion to the story. Start a new run and do it again. Which ending you receive is determined by the number of orbs of true knowledge you've collected in the current run. Oh, I forgot to tell you about the orbs of true knowledge. These are what control the meta progression in Noita. When picked up, these will give you the accompanying spell as well as unlocking that spell permanently for future runs. This trickle of content along with the thrill of exploration and discovery turned Noita from a one more run kind of game into a one more run kind of game. Seriously, I haven't had this much fun hunting for ability synergy since Slay the Spire. Each run may last less than an hour on its own, but the variety of each one coupled with interesting decisions and the rush when the RNG goes just right makes for a game I'd be happy to sink over 100 hours into. Noita has an asking price of $19.99, and often goes on sale for just half that. Even at full price, I'd say that this game has more fun per dollar than most AAA titles I've played in the past few years. It's currently on Steam and GOG, and unfortunately there are no plans to bring it to consoles. Noita came along and unlocked a nostalgic set of memories from my childhood, while simultaneously bringing a fresh experience. It is unfair to characterize Noita as simply a roguelite inspired by Falling Sand games, because there's so much more here. The density of interesting decisions to be made by the player ranks up there with the established elites of the genre such as The Binding of Isaac and Slay the Spire. My early runs were difficult, bordering on frustrating. And with so many of the systems being opaque and unclear with no effort by the game to bring the player up to speed, I ended up needing to research online to understand how the game was intended to be played. And yet, I adored my time with Noita. Every run I attempted and inevitably failed taught me new information, and I could feel myself getting good. There isn't another game out there quite like it, and I'm happy to keep it installed on my PC in the off chance I feel like going for one more run. Noita is well worth the cost of admission, and will be a mainstay in the library of any fan of the roguelite genre. Player's Perspective recommends.